I paid $250 for a storage unit full of someone else's forgotten life, and I almost didn't go to that auction at all. It was a Saturday in late October, one of those gray mornings where the sky can't decide between rain and just being miserable about itself. I'd been awake since 4 because that's what grief does. It steals your sleep and gives you nothing in return. My mother had passed 8 months earlier, and I was still doing that thing where you fill every weekend with activity so you don't have to sit in your own apartment and feel the shape of her absence. A coworker, Bethany Ostrowski, had mentioned the auction the week before. She and her husband went sometimes for fun, she said. You never know what you'll find. I'd laughed it off at the time, but that Saturday morning I was desperate enough to try anything. The facility was called Clearview Self-Storage, out on Route 9 near the edge of Denton, Virginia. About 40 people showed up, which surprised me. I didn't know this was a whole community, people with clipboards and flashlights and the quiet confidence of regulars who'd done this 100 times. I stood near the back, feeling like I'd wandered into someone else's hobby. The auctioneer, a short man named Phil, who wore the same expression whether he was excited or bored, moved us through the first 3 units quickly. One was full of exercise equipment. Another had mostly water-damaged furniture. The third was someone's Christmas decoration collection, gone wildly out of control. None of them reached anything I'd have called competitive bidding. Then we stopped in front of Unit 47. Phil lifted the rolling door, and even from where I stood at the back of the crowd, I could see it was different. The unit was packed floor to ceiling, but organized. Labeled bins, wooden shelving bolted into the walls, furniture covered in moving blankets that had been folded at the corners. Whoever had stored this had cared about it. This wasn't someone tossing things out. This was someone who thought they were coming back. Bidding opened at $75. I don't fully understand why I raised my hand. Maybe it was the shelving. Maybe it was the careful way the blankets were folded. Maybe it was just that 4 in the morning and 8 months of grief will make you do things you can't explain. I raised my hand once, and then twice, and then the room went quiet, and Phil pointed at me and said sold, $250, and I thought, what did I just do? I had 3 days to clear it out. That's the rule. Whatever's inside becomes yours, but you're responsible for removing it. And if you don't, you lose your deposit and they charge you for disposal. I rented a cargo van from a place on the highway and drove back out there that same afternoon. The first hour was unremarkable. Boxes of books, mostly literary fiction and some gardening reference guides. A disassembled dining set that turned out to be solid oak, which alone was probably worth what I'd paid. A floor lamp with a stained glass shade. 2 leather suitcases, old ones, the hard-sided kind with the brass latches. I set those aside to look at later. Near the back, behind a wardrobe wrapped in moving blankets, was a wooden filing cabinet. 4 drawers, the old kind, heavy enough that I had to drag it rather than carry it. The bottom drawer was locked. The other 3 were full of hanging folders, utility bills, insurance documents, car service records, all belonging to someone named Edmund Gable. The dates on everything stopped in 2019. I thought the locked drawer was probably just stuck, or maybe the key was somewhere in the unit. I spent another 20 minutes looking before I gave up and loaded everything into the van. I figured I'd deal with it at home. It took me 2 trips and most of my Saturday to get everything back to my apartment complex, where I stacked it all in the spare bedroom that had become a kind of holding area for things I didn't know what to do with. My mother's jewelry boxes were in there, and a few bags of her clothes I couldn't bring myself to donate. The filing cabinet went against the wall. I told myself I'd look at the locked drawer tomorrow. I didn't look at it tomorrow. I looked at it 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday, when I couldn't sleep and ran out of other distractions. I found a locksmith tutorial online, worked at it for 20 minutes with a letter opener and a bobby pin, and felt embarrassingly proud of myself when the drawer finally gave. Inside was a metal cash box, the kind you'd buy at an office supply store, gray with a small keyhole that was already unlocked. I lifted it out. It was heavier than I expected. I set it on my kitchen table and stood there for a moment before I opened it. There were 5 envelopes inside, the large manila kind, each one sealed and labeled in precise handwriting. The labels read, "For Edmund Jr., for the house, for taxes owed, for Carolyn if she asks," and one that just said, "Read this first." I opened "Read this first." The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, dated March 14, 2019. The handwriting was shaky in places but deliberate. It began, "My name is Walter Gable. I am 78 years old, and I know I don't have much time left. What follows is the only honest accounting I have left to give." I sat down. Walter Gable, the letter explained, had spent 30 years as a property manager for a company that had since dissolved. Over those 30 years, he had skimmed, small amounts at first, then larger ones when he realized no one was paying close enough attention. He wasn't proud of it. The letter said that several times, as though repetition could function as penance. By the end, he had accumulated, in cash, a sum that he had kept hidden, because he didn't know what else to do with money he'd never been able to deposit without questions. He listed the amount. I read it twice. Then, I got up and drank a glass of water and read it a 3rd time. The 5 envelopes contained a total of $480,000. Walter's letter explained that the "For Edmund Jr." envelope was for his son, who didn't know the money existed. The "For the House" envelope was supposed to cover deferred maintenance on the family home in Shenandoah County. "For taxes owed" was self-explanatory. Walter had calculated, as best he could, what he believed he owed in back taxes on the undeclared income. "For Carolyn, if she asks," Carolyn was, apparently, a former colleague he'd wronged specifically, and the money was meant as a private restitution if she ever came forward. Walter had died before distributing any of it. The storage unit had been prepaid for 5 years, and no one had come to claim it. I didn't sleep that night. The first person I called in the morning was my sister, Bridget. She picked up on the 2nd ring, which meant she was already awake and already worrying about something. Bridget operates that way. I told her what I'd found, and she was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Don't touch the envelopes," she said finally. "I already opened one." "Don't touch anything else." She paused. "Actually, don't tell anyone else yet. Not until you talk to a lawyer. Bridget is the practical one. I'm the one who buys storage units at 8 in the morning because I can't deal with my feelings. I found an attorney through the Virginia State Bar's referral service, a woman named Catherine Bellamy, who specialized in estate and property law and had an office in downtown Fredericksburg. I called at 9 and got an appointment for the following afternoon. In the meantime, I photographed everything: the cash box, each envelope, the letter, the cash inside each envelope, and I sent the photos to my own email and to Bridget's. Catherine Bellamy's office was on the 2nd floor of a building that looked like it had been a bank in a previous life. She was probably 60, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the kind of calm that comes from having seen every variety of human problem. I laid out the whole story. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, and then she asked me several questions I hadn't thought to ask myself. Whether I still had the auction receipt, whether I'd signed anything beyond the standard release form, whether anyone else had bid on Unit 47. I had the receipt. I'd signed only the standard form. I was the only bidder who'd gone above $100. "All right," Catherine said. "Here's where you stand. Virginia law on found property is clearer than most people expect. You purchased the contents of that unit at a lawful auction. The contents, including that filing cabinet and what was inside it, transferred to you at the time of sale. However, and this matters, cash is treated differently than other property in some circumstances, particularly when there's clear evidence of the original owner's intent." She tapped the photos I'd printed out for her. "This letter changes things. Walter Gable expressed specific intentions for this money. That doesn't automatically override your ownership, but it does create a more complicated picture, especially if his estate can be located, or if the named beneficiaries come forward. Edmund Jr., I said. "Exactly. If Edmund Gable the younger is locatable and makes a claim, you'd want to be ahead of that rather than behind it." Catherine's advice was methodical. Step 1, notify the county sheriff's office that I'd found a significant amount of cash to create an official record of the discovery date and circumstances. Step 2, reach out to an estate attorney who could help determine whether Walter Gable's estate had been formally probated, and if so, whether the storage unit's contents had been listed as an asset. Step 3, do not distribute or spend any of the money until legal counsel confirmed it was safe to do so. I did all 3 things. The sheriff's office sent a deputy to my apartment who took photographs and filed a report. Catherine connected me with a colleague who handled probate, a man named Stephen Chu, who had the kind of precise energy I associated with people who never lose paperwork. Stephen confirmed within a week that Walter Gable had died in November 2019, that his estate had been probated in Shenandoah County, and that the storage unit had not been listed among the assets. Edmund Gable Jr. had been the sole heir of record. That meant the estate was closed. The assets it hadn't captured, the ones sitting in my spare bedroom, were, legally, another matter. I want to be honest about something. There were days during those weeks when I thought about what $480,000 could mean. I don't think that makes me a bad person. I think it makes me a person. I thought about my mother's medical bills that I was still paying down in installments. I thought about my own apartment, which I rented, and how I'd always wanted to own something, but never quite managed to save enough while also having a life. I thought about a lot of things. And then I thought about Walter Gable's shaky handwriting and his line about the only honest accounting I have left to give, and I put those thoughts away. Catherine had located an address for Edmund Gable Jr. through public records. He lived in Knoxville, Tennessee, and his phone number was listed. She recommended that I not contact him directly, that if he became aware of the situation, it should go through legal channels where there was documentation. He became aware of it before we could control that. Someone talked, I don't know who, whether it was someone at the storage facility or someone at the sheriff's office or just the particular way that small communities transmit information. But about 3 weeks after I filed the report, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize with a Tennessee area code. The man on the other end of the line said his name was Edmund Gable. His voice was flat and controlled in the way that people's voices get when they're working very hard not to sound like what they're actually feeling. "I understand you found some property that belonged to my father," he said. I told him I was represented by legal counsel and that I'd have my attorney reach out to him. "I'm not looking for a fight," he said. "I just want to understand what you found." I repeated that he should contact my attorney, thanked him, and ended the call. Then I sat on my kitchen floor for about 10 minutes. He had a lawyer by the following week, a man named Todd Prentice, out of Knoxville, who sent a letter to Catherine outlining Edmund's position, that the contents of the storage unit should have been included in his father's estate, that the failure to inventory them before the unit was auctioned constituted an administrative error, and that Edmund intended to pursue recovery of the cash. Catherine read me the letter over the phone with the steady tone of someone delivering information rather than a verdict. "Is he right?" I asked. "He's making an argument," she said. "Whether it's a winning argument depends on several things. First, who was responsible for inventorying the unit before auction? That's on the storage facility, not on you. Second, whether the estate can demonstrate that the unit was ever listed as an asset. Stephen has already confirmed it wasn't. Third, the legal treatment of found property in Virginia, which, as I mentioned, is on your side. What about the letter? What Walter wrote about wanting Edmund to have the money in that envelope?" Catherine paused. "That letter is not a will. It has no legal force. It's a statement of intent by someone who died before acting on that intent. It's relevant to understand the history of the property, but it doesn't create an obligation." I sat with that for a moment. "What do I want to do?" I said, which was less a question to her and more a question to myself. "That's entirely up to you," she said. "You're under no legal obligation to give Edmund Gable anything. I knew that. I'd known it for a while. But knowing you're not obligated to do something isn't the same as knowing what to do." I asked Catherine to get a full accounting of the cash. How much was in each envelope, the condition of the bills, all of it documented formally. I asked Stephen Chu whether the people Walter had named in the letter were locatable. He found Edmund Jr. already. Carolyn turned out to be a woman named Carolyn Tate, who had worked at the same property management company as Walter, and had indeed filed a complaint against the company in 2011 that had been dismissed. She was in her mid-70s now, living in Roanoke. I made a decision. I called Catherine and told her what I wanted to do. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I want to make sure you've thought this through completely." "I have," I said. "I've thought about almost nothing else for 2 months." The storage facility, it turned out, had failed to notify Walter's estate before auctioning the unit. Virginia law requires notification to the last known address of the account holder, and while they had sent a letter, they'd sent it to an address Walter had moved from in 2017. The storage company's legal team got involved quickly once Catherine sent a letter of inquiry. They settled separately, paying into an account that Catherine controlled as part of the overall resolution. What I did with the money, I kept the portion that represented my clear, uncontested ownership, the non-cash contents of the unit, which I sold over the following months for a total of around $9,000. The filing cabinet went to an antique resale shop. The dining set sold in 3 days on Facebook Marketplace. From the cash, I distributed the envelope Walter had labeled for taxes owed to the IRS, working through a tax attorney who handled the voluntary disclosure. That was approximately $62,000. Catherine connected me with a nonprofit that specialized in these situations. People coming forward voluntarily with unpaid taxes years after the fact. It was more complicated than it sounds, but not impossible. Edmund Gable Jr. received the contents of the For Edmund Jr. envelope, plus a proportional share of what remained after the tax payment and legal fees. His attorney, Todd Prentice, sent a letter of acknowledgement that was formal and brief and contained, somewhere near the end, a sentence that said his client appreciated the resolution. I chose to read something genuine into that. Carolyn Tate was harder to reach. Stephen Chu found her phone number through public records, and I asked Catherine whether I could contact her directly, now that the legal matters were resolved. Catherine said there was no reason I couldn't. I called Carolyn on a Wednesday afternoon in February, about 4 months after the auction. She picked up on the fifth ring, sounding slightly out of breath, and I explained who I was and why I was calling and what Walter Gable's letter had said about her. There was a very long silence. "He wrote that," she said finally. Her voice had the texture of someone who has spent a long time not expecting to be surprised. "He did," I said. "He named you specifically. He said if she asks." "I thought you should know even if you didn't ask." She didn't say much after that. We were on the phone for maybe 10 more minutes, and most of it was the particular quiet of two people who are both processing something at the same time. I told her the amount. She said she'd need to think about whether she wanted to accept it. I said that was completely reasonable and gave her Catherine's number. She called Catherine 3 days later. She accepted. What I kept in the end was a small amount. The portion that Catherine confirmed was mine by any reasonable legal or ethical standard, the money that represented neither Walter's stolen income nor the named recipient's shares, but rather the administrative settlement from the storage company and some reimbursement for legal fees and my own time. It was less than I could have kept. It was more than I'd had before that gray Saturday in October. I still have the read this first letter. I kept a copy of it. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because Walter Gable tried at the end to do something right, and that matters to me even though it came late and cost him nothing by then. Maybe because I think about my own mother and the things she left behind, and how the people who come after us have to decide what to do with all of it. My spare bedroom doesn't have my mother's boxes in it anymore. I finally donated her clothes in January. I kept the jewelry boxes because those were mine to keep. Some of the storage unit's books are still on my shelves. The gardening guides mostly. I've started trying to keep houseplants alive, which is harder than it sounds and so far going mixed. One of the books had a note in the margin next to a section about patience and root systems. Give it time. Things grow slower than you think, but deeper too. I don't know if Walter wrote that or someone who owned the book before him. But I've read it a few times since February, and I think about it more than I expected to.